Sir, please stop what you're doing and keep your hands where we can see them.
All right, I'm stopping. What's going on?
Slowly step down the ladder. Take your time.
Get down from that ladder immediately. I've called the federal government. A cold, sharp voice rang out from the yard below, shattering the quiet morning in a wealthy Maryland suburb. A black man, leaning against the second-floor ladder of a colonial-style house, paused, his paintbrush still stained, his gaze slowly sweeping down at the woman standing with her arms crossed on the lawn as if she owned the entire neighborhood. His name was Lawrence Bennett, 38 years old, the owner of a house painting company that had been in business for over 15 years. But just 20 minutes earlier, Lawrence had been a legitimate, contracted, and undisturbed worker. Now, he was being asked to prove who he was, right where he was born. The garage security camera had captured the entire moment. From the moment the neighbor woman crossed the street, took a picture of the truck with the company logo, zoomed in on the license plate, to the statement that completely changed the atmosphere. "You don't look like you belong around here." It wasn't a question. It was a verdict. That woman's name was Patricia Hendricks. She believed she was doing the right thing. That calling a federal agency to check in a black man doing manual labor was the duty of a model citizen. And what Patricia didn't know was that the call wouldn't get Lawrence out of the neighborhood. It would land her straight into a federal civil rights lawsuit, costing the entire system nearly $15 million. Before continuing, please comment where you're watching this video. If this is your first time on the channel, don't forget to subscribe because stories like this need to be told. And what's about to happen will make you understand why a prejudiced phone call can destroy more lives than you think. Lawrence Bennett wasn't a stranger who'd wandered into that neighborhood. He was the product of 3 generations of black men who had fought to be allowed to work with their hands. Lawrence's grandfather was a Cleveland builder in the 1962, one of the very few black men accepted into the construction union after years of outright rejection. He wasn't given a chance. He had to earn it himself, brick by brick, project by project, every skeptical glance overcome with undeniable skill. Lawrence's father followed in his footsteps in the 1982, starting a small contracting firm at a time when black people were almost unable to borrow money, couldn't access large clients, and were often implicitly considered inadequate. He taught Lawrence only one thing if you want to survive. You have to be better than others, not equal to them. Lawrence learned house painting from his uncle during sweltering summers, standing for hours in the sun to learn how to create perfectly straight lines and how to treat surfaces so that not a single flaw was visible. His uncle once said, "Others make mistakes because they are careless. You make mistakes because you are you. Therefore, you are not allowed to make mistakes." That saying followed Lawrence into college, through the 2008 economic recession, and into his bold decision to start his own company when no one else would hire him. Bennett Custom Painting began with just an old car, a few cans of paint, and an unwavering belief that quality speaks for itself. 15 years later, Lawrence has 6 employees, 3 trucks, and hundreds of loyal customers. He pays above-average wages, provides insurance, and has never left a project unfinished. His reputation doesn't come from advertising, but from the silence of those who no longer have reason to doubt him. And that's why, in that moment of being under the scrutinizing gaze of a stranger, Lawrence felt more than just anger. He felt an entire history being pulled back. That morning would have passed like hundreds of other mornings in Lawrence Bennett's career. He set up the ladder, spread out the tarp, checked the paint in the gentle early May sunlight, and began the first brushstrokes on the second floor of the Whitmore house. His hand movements were steady, his breathing slow, a task so familiar it was almost meditative. The neighborhood was quiet in a way characteristic of wealthy suburbs. No children. No neighbors gathering. Only birdsong and the occasional slow-moving car disappearing. Lawrence was used to feeling invisible in places like this, and he always considered it a good thing. Until 9:47 a.m. A white BMW pulled up across the street. The garage security camera recorded it. The car door opened, and a woman stepped out, blonde hair neatly tied back. Expensive athletic wear. The confident gait of someone accustomed to being listened to. She didn't leave immediately. She stood on the sidewalk, looking up at Lawrence. At first, curiosity, then suspicion, and finally, a clear decision formed on her face. Patricia Hendricks pulled out her phone. The camera captured her, snapping a series of photos, Lawrence on the ladder. The truck parked in the yard with the company logo clearly visible. Then, zooming in on the license plate. No question. No greeting. No verification. Then Patricia crossed the street and walked straight into the Whitmore driveway as if it were her own private entrance. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice anything but friendly. "What are you doing here?" Lawrence stopped, looking down. "Hello, ma'am. I'm painting the house. The homeowner hired me." Patricia crossed her arms, her eyes cold. "I spoke with Mrs. Whitmore last week. She didn't mention having any workers." The statement sounded normal, but Lawrence immediately sensed something was amiss. It wasn't a question to find out. It was a question to pick a fault. He answered calmly, professionally. But Patricia wasn't listening to understand. She was listening to decide who belonged here and who didn't. And from that moment, things began to spiral out of control. Lawrence returned to his work, hoping the exchange would end there. He'd learned early on that sometimes the safest thing to do was to avoid unnecessary conversations. But Patricia Hendricks wasn't here to ask questions. She was here to assert her authority. "Wait," Patricia said, her voice sharper than before. "You're here alone, aren't you?" Lawrence slowly descended a step, keeping his voice even and low. "Yes. My team is finishing another project. The homeowner gave me permission to work today." Patricia shook her head, her gaze sweeping across the neighborhood as if searching for invisible support. "That's not right. I've lived here for over 10 years. I know who comes and goes in this area. And you don't seem like the kind of person who usually appears here." The words fell on the courtyard like a heavy weight. No longer a doubt. No longer curiosity. It was classification. Lawrence felt a tightness in his chest, a familiar, old feeling. The kind he'd experienced at the supermarket, in the parking lot, in places where his presence always required an explanation. He took a deep breath, climbed down the ladder completely, and stood a safe distance from Patricia. "Madam," he said slowly, each word clear, "I'm here because I'm hired. I have a contract. I have a permit. I'm doing this work legally." Patricia gave a faint smile. "Legal, I'm not sure." She pulled out her phone, this time not to take a picture, but to hold it tightly in her hand. "This area has had problems with illegal labor in the past. I won't let that happen again." Lawrence frowned. "What are you talking about?" "I'm saying," Patricia emphasized each word, "that I'm going to call the federal government to have them check. If you have nothing to hide, you don't have to worry." In that moment, Lawrence understood that all lines of politeness had been erased. This was no longer a matter of a grumpy neighbor. This was a threat wrapped in the language of civic responsibility. To ask matters after first. "I'm an American citizen," Lawrence said, his voice beginning to stiffen. "I was born in Ohio. I own this company. Patricia looked at him, her eyes icy. Everyone says so. And right in front of Lawrence, right on the driveway of a house he legally rented, Patricia Hendricks began dialing, not to resolve a misunderstanding, but to summon power upon him. From that moment, this story was no longer just between two people. It had shifted to an entirely different level. Patricia Hendricks didn't lower her voice when she called, nor did she move from her position. Instead, she stood upright in the middle of the driveway, close enough for Lawrence to hear every word, as if to make sure he understood exactly what was happening. "Yes, I want to report a suspected case of illegal employment," Patricia said into the phone, her tone eerily calm. "There's a man working at a house in our neighborhood." Lawrence stood still. No interrupting. No arguing. Part of him hoped a faint hope that after hearing it, the other side would ask basic questions. That they would ask for proof. That they would end this pointless call. But Patricia continued. "He's here alone. The homeowner isn't here. I don't know who he is. He doesn't look like someone who lives around here." She paused for a moment, as if considering what else to add to make the call more credible. Maybe Hispanic, or maybe black. I'm not sure, but definitely not one of us. Security cameras clearly showed Lawrence clenching his jaw. Not out of fear, but out of anger. Controlling his breathing, Patricia glanced at him as she continued. "Yes, I think this needs checking. We can't have people like that working in the neighborhood without verification." People like that. That phrase hung in the air, heavier than any curse. Patricia nodded repeatedly, as if seeking confirmation. "Yes, I'll wait. Thank you for the quick response." She hung up, turning to Lawrence with a cold smile. "They'll be here. If you haven't done anything wrong, then there's nothing to worry about." "Right." Lawrence stared directly at her. "You just called a federal agency to check on an American citizen just because you don't like me." Patricia crossed her arms, looking confident. "I'm just doing what needs to be done." At that moment, Lawrence pulled out his phone, not to call an apology, but to record everything. "For my safety," he stated clearly, raising the camera. "And to document what's happening here." Patricia shrugged. "Go ahead. The truth isn't afraid of cameras." She had no idea that very camera would become the very thing that would make escape impossible. And somewhere, on the way to this quiet neighborhood, federal power was being wielded by a call with no evidence. Lawrence had just hung up the phone when a silver car swerved sharply into the driveway. The screeching of brakes shattered the neighborhood's quiet. Helen Whitmore stepped out first, her face flushed with anger. Her husband, Robert, followed closely behind, his eyes cold as if he knew exactly what had happened. "Patricia," Helen said loudly, her voice trembling with rage. "What did you just do?" Patricia turned around, not flinching. "I'm protecting this neighborhood. This man is here alone. Very suspicious." Helen pointed directly at Lawrence. "This is Lawrence Bennett. I hired him. I have a contract. I have a permit. He's been working here since yesterday. You have no right to call anyone." Patricia crossed her arms, her voice defensive. "How would I know? He doesn't look like an ordinary painter." "Not like one." Lawrence and Helen both froze. Robert stepped forward, his voice low and slow. "Can you explain more clearly what you mean by not the same?" Patricia hesitated for a very brief moment. Then she said quickly, "Everyone here knows each other. I've never seen him before." Lawrence couldn't hold back any longer. "Because I don't live here. I work here. That's the difference." Helen turned to Patricia, her anger unconcealed. You just called the federal authorities, didn't you? Patricia didn't deny it. If he's legal, there's no problem. They'll check and leave. Robert clenched his jaw. Do you understand what you just did? You used the power of the state to attack a legal worker just because of your prejudice. As the argument escalated, several doors in the neighborhood opened. Neighbors began to come out. Drawn by the loud voices and tense atmosphere, a woman walking her dog stopped. A man across the street raised his phone to film. Lawrence stood between them. A familiar feeling returning, the feeling of being placed at the center of an informal trial, where he was the accused despite his innocence. Helen turned to Lawrence, her voice low but full of remorse. I'm sorry. I didn't think this could go this far. Lawrence nodded. I understand. But now we have to wait. And just then, from the end of the street, the deep rumble of an engine echoed. A black SUV was approaching. No one spoke. But they all understood. That call had been answered. The black SUV pulled up across the street, its engine still humming slowly as if in warning. The doors opened. Two people stepped out, their body armor neat, federal insignia reflecting the midday sun. No lengthy introductions were needed. A single glance was enough for everyone around to understand this was no longer a neighborly affair. The man in front spoke. We received a report of a potential federal violation at this address. Patricia immediately stepped forward, as if she had been waiting for this moment. I called. That man works here. I don't trust him legally. Helen stepped forward, shielding Lawrence. I am the homeowner. I hired him. He has a contract and all the necessary permits. This woman has no connection to my property. The agent nodded slightly, then turned to Lawrence. Sir, we need you to get down from the elevator and show your credentials. Lawrence stood still for a brief moment. It wasn't because he didn't understand the request, but because he understood its meaning. The homeowner had confirmed it. The contract was clear. But he, the black man holding the paintbrush, was still the one who had to prove it. I am an American citizen, Lawrence said, his voice low but clear. I own this company. That's what we need to verify. The agent replied, his voice flat, uncommenting. Helen exploded. Are you serious? I'm standing here confirming it. Ma'am, step back, the second agent said. We're on duty. That statement slammed shut the door to dialogue. Lawrence slowly descended the ladder, each step slow and deliberate. His hands always in a visible position, movements he'd been taught since he was a young black boy, learning to be safe from authority. The neighbors around him fell silent. Phones were held higher. The garage camera continued recording everything. Not missing a single movement. My papers are in the car, Lawrence said. We'll go with you, the agent replied. In that moment, Lawrence realized this was no longer a misunderstanding. This was a test of his very existence, triggered by a prejudiced phone call, and now, it was happening right in front of the whole neighborhood. And the hardest part was only just beginning. Lawrence slowly opened the truck door, each movement carefully considered, not because he had something to hide, but because he understood that. In moments like these, every gesture could be misinterpreted. He retrieved a leather briefcase from the passenger seat and placed it on the hood as the agent had instructed. Driver's license, Maryland State Business License, Contractor's License, Liability Insurance, the signed contract with the homeowner. Each sheet of paper was neatly arranged, clear, and complete. The agent picked up each sheet, examining it under the sunlight as if searching for the slightest error. He photographed it. Read the numbers. made notes, then passed it to a colleague. After that, he turned around and made a verification call. 5 minutes passed, then 10 minutes. Lawrence stood still, his hands hanging loosely at his sides, feeling the gazes of his neighbors fixed on his back. Some were curious, some were annoyed, some were beginning to understand what was happening. But no matter what kind of gaze it was, it made him feel exposed. Patricia stood on the opposite sidewalk, arms crossed, her face showing undisguised satisfaction. This was exactly the scene she wanted to see: a black man forced to explain himself, detained, and interrogated in front of the entire neighborhood. Helen Whitmore paced back and forth. "This is ridiculous," she said softly but sharply. "He has all the necessary documents. You're humiliating him." No one answered. 15 minutes, 20 minutes. Each passing second deepened a familiar feeling in Lawrence, the feeling that all his achievements, all his efforts over the past 15 years, could be erased by a single prejudice. That, despite his licenses, contracts, reputation. In this moment, he was still just a suspect. Finally, the agent returned. His voice was neutral, almost emotionless. "Mr. Bennett, your papers are valid. You are a U.S.S.N. Debris citizen." The air fell silent. Lawrence didn't breathe a sigh of relief. He just smiled, a short, dry smile. "I said that from the beginning." 20 minutes had passed, and they would never be returned. "Your paperwork is valid. You may continue your work." The words were spoken lightly, as if the past 20 minutes had been a minor delay. But to Lawrence Bennett, they felt like a slap in the face. "Continue," he asked again, his voice low but tense. "You dragged me down the ladder, surrounded me in front of the neighbors, made me prove who I am, and then told me to continue, as if nothing happened." The agents stood still. "We're just responding to a report we received." "A discriminatory report?" Lawrence replied bluntly. "No evidence. No suspicious behavior. Just one person who found me unpleasant." Helen Whitmore stepped forward, unable to restrain herself any longer. "You've just humiliated an innocent man on my property. I'm the homeowner. I confirm. But you're ignoring me." The second agent spoke up. "Ma'am. We? No." Helen interrupted. "You chose to trust a prejudiced phone call over the homeowner's confirmation." Robert Whitmore stepped forward, his voice cold and precise, like in a courtroom. "I'm a lawyer, and what just happened here wasn't a routine check. This was an unfounded investigatory stop, based on unverified allegations, with clear signs of discrimination." He pointed to the security camera. It was all recorded. Every word. Every minute he was held. Lawrence took a deep breath, trying to remain calm. "I work by my reputation. Clients trust me because they see me as professional. Today, in front of the whole neighborhood, you've made me the suspect. Do you understand how quickly this will spread?" A few neighbors nodded. Someone muttered, "They've gone too far." The agent finally said the familiar line, "We apologize for the inconvenience." Lawrence shook his head. "This isn't inconvenience. This is infringement. And I'm not going to let this slide." That was the moment everything changed. No longer a worker trying to get back to work, but a citizen whose rights had just been violated and who had decided to reclaim them. That evening, Lawrence Bennett didn't return to work. He went straight home, sat alone in his garage, staring at his familiar tools as if they were silent witnesses to what had just happened. The 20 minutes he'd spent standing in the driveway were still fresh in his mind, the neighbor's gaze, the agent's cold voice, Patricia's satisfied smile. He understood one thing perfectly if he ignored it. It would happen again, not just to him, but to anyone who didn't seem to belong there. 3 days later, Lawrence walked into the office of Morrison and Associates, a civil rights law firm in Washington. Dud. C. He carried a USB drive containing all the security camera footage, his own phone recordings, the contract, the license, and a resolve he could no longer hesitate to make. Lawyer Rebecca Morrison watched the video once, then a second time. On the third attempt, she paused, took off her glasses, and said slowly, "Mr. Bennett, this is not a misunderstanding. This is a clearly recorded sequence of discriminatory behavior." She pointed to the screen, which was paused at the moment Patricia said, "People like that." This call triggered state power, and the agents acted without verification. That's a violation of civil rights. Lawrence asked a single question, "Can we win?" Rebecca nodded. "With this evidence, we can not only win, we can hold them accountable." She outlined her plan to sue Patricia for false reporting, harassment, and emotional distress, sue the federal agency and the agents for unlawful detention, racial profiling, and violation of the Fourth Amendment. "We can settle," Rebecca said, quickly, with little fuss. Lawrence shook his head. "No. I want a jury. I want them to see this. I want it on record." Rebecca smiled faintly. "Then we'll go to court." And in that moment, the story was no longer about a humiliating morning but about holding an entire system accountable. The federal trial opened on a cold Washington, D.C. morning. The courtroom was packed reporters, civil rights activists, small contractors from all over the area, and people who understood that this case wasn't just about Lawrence Bennett. It was about who was presumed innocent in this society. Lawrence sat upright before a jury of 12 ordinary citizens. He didn't need to act. He just told his story. He told about the morning he was pulled down while painting his house. He told about the 20 minutes he stood silently before his neighbors. He told about the feeling of having to prove he was allowed to exist. Before that day, Lawrence said, his voice low but clear, "I loved my job." After that day, every time a car slowed down near the construction site, I thought, who will they call this time? Lawyer Rebecca Morrison showed the video from the garage camera. The courtroom fell silent as Patricia appeared on the screen, as she took pictures, as she said, "Hispanic or maybe black, and people like that." No comment needed. The images spoke for themselves. Next came the body cam footage of the agents. The jury saw clearly no verification questions, no specific inquiries, only requests for documents even after the homeowner had confirmed. One juror shook his head slightly. Another crossed his arms, frowning. A sociologist was called upon to explain the phenomenon of working while black, where manual labor by black people is automatically considered suspicious. "This is not an isolated case," he said. "This is a pattern." The defense countered. The agents were only doing their job. Rebecca retorted succinctly, "The job does not include disregarding independent judgment." When the arguments ended, the room remained silent. The truth stood before them clear. Needless to say, and the jury departed to deliberate. The jury deliberated for nearly 3 days. 12 strangers, from different backgrounds, sat together to answer a single question: is what happened to Lawrence Bennett acceptable in a society governed by the rule of law? When they returned to the courtroom, the atmosphere was so heavy no one dared breathe. Lawrence sat silently, his hands clasped together. His mother sat behind him, clutching a tissue. Patricia Hendricks no longer had her usual confidence. Her face was pale, her eyes averted. The judge called for order. The jury rose. The verdict was read clearly, word for word, responsible. On all charges, Patricia Hendricks was found guilty of making false statements, harassment, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The federal agency and its agents were found guilty of violating civil rights, unlawful detention, and discrimination. Then came the compensation. The number echoed through the courtroom like a hammer blow. 10,000,000 yuan. Wit million. Not a gift, but a declaration. Patricia Hendricks went bankrupt in less than 2 months. She sold her house, left the neighborhood, and her name was forever tied to a case that became a precedent. A seemingly harmless call had ruined her life. 2 federal agents were immediately suspended. One resigned before being fired. The other was transferred from the scene and carried a disciplinary record for life. The federal agency was forced to change its procedures, no more blindly reacting to calls motivated by discrimination. And Lawrence Bennett, he didn't celebrate. He returned to work, but this time with a new decision to use part of the compensation to establish a legal aid fund for discriminated workers and small business owners, so that when this happens again, and it will happen, others won't be alone. The Whitmore house is now painted a perfect pale gray. On the front door, they've placed a small sign, painted by Bennett Custom Painting, Excellence, even when tested. Because this story was never just about a painter, it's a reminder that a prejudiced call can trigger an entire system. But the truth, when recorded and brought to light, can force an entire system to pay the price. If you believe that no one should have to prove their right to exist because of their skin color or their job, subscribe to the channel. Tomorrow, we'll tell another story. And it also begins with a seemingly very ordinary call.